If high-speed rail should work anywhere in America, it's here. Below this line lives a population of nearly 20 million people. 6.5 million in the Miami metro area, 3 million in the Tampa metro, and another 2.5 million in the Orlando area. This massive population is relatively confined by American standards, meaning it's dense and centralized enough to coalesce around a few stations. And with each of these three metro areas sitting within about 200 miles or 320 kilometers from each other, they're close enough that flying is awkwardly involved, but far enough that fighting interstate traffic for hours is a pain. There are also plenty of reasons to move between these areas. There are the beaches along the East Coast, the businesses on the shores of Tampa Bay, the culture emanating out of Miami, and the entertainment of Orlando that each pull out-of-town tourists, in-state travelers, and Floridian business people alike from one city to the next. And finally, geographically speaking, there's really little getting in the way of the rails. No mountain ranges, no gaping canyons, no physical impediments that would require any great feat of engineering. Of course, none of this is anything new. As far back as the 80s, Floridians and federal planners alike have been scouring over maps, calculating projections, and pitching the idea of connecting Tampa to Orlando to Miami with a train route that wouldn't cost the traveler a day, but a matter of hours. But no public-private partnership could get it done in the 80s. Nor could they get it done in the 90s, nor the 2000s, nor, for that matter, the 2010s. But not long after the most recent public-private partnership died on Governor Rick Scott's desk in 2011, came another high-speed rail pitch, one equal parts exciting and far off. It was called All Aboard Florida. It launched in 2012 and projected that, at a cost of $1 billion, it'd be running a service from South Florida to Orlando by 2014. Like those before it, All Aboard Florida blew through its initial cost estimate and far past its projected opening date. But unlike those before it, All Aboard Florida, now rebranded as Brightline, actually opened for actual rail passengers in 2018. Fast and fully private, it was the first of its kind in the US. The initial service was modest. Far from the vision of 230 miles or 370 kilometers of track connecting the major metro areas of Central and South Florida, the deeply discounted $10 and $15 tickets offered on January 13, 2018 could get a traveler not from Orlando to Miami, but the 40 minutes from Fort Lauderdale to West Palm Beach. And while service would soon expand to the 66 miles or 110 kilometers connecting West Palm Beach and Miami, Brightline still wasn't offering a high-speed rail service, but rather a higher speed service. Not yet touching the 125-mile or 200-kilometer-per-hour high-speed criteria, but maxing out at 79 miles or 130 kilometers per hour. Still only running a 70-mile stretch at pedestrian speeds by the rest of the world's standards, Brightline opening to real-life customers in 2018 marked an extreme rarity in the US. A new passenger rail project actually becoming a real-world reality. High-speed or even higher-speed rail represents the ultimate long-term investment, and Brightline is no exception. Of course, Brightline, for its part, had some advantages. Most notably the fact that its parent company, Florida East Coast Industries, just so happened to be the owner of the Florida East Coast Railway. While other suitors would have to negotiate and lease a rail corridor, Brightline already had access to the very railroad that had effectively built South Florida a century prior. But having access to a rail corridor was only the first step. To run frequent and fast service, Brightline first had to build an entirely new second set of rails along more than 2/3 of the 66-mile corridor. While straightforward enough, double tracking takes time and money, and making this more difficult were the rivers and canals the rail had to cross. While each was already spanned by a bridge, nearly every bridge was only wide enough for one set of rails, not two, so nearly all had to be replaced. Then, in the sections where rail could be reused, there was the issue of alignment. To accommodate passenger trains moving at twice the speed of the freight trains for which the rails had been designed, crews would need to manually move rail into more gradual turns and straighter alignments. Just these rail alterations alone, not to mention all the signaling upgrades and siding alterations, along just this section of rail represented 3 years of work by the company. While readying the rails, Brightline needed stations too. It started with these three, building each from the ground up and negotiating agreements and connections with each municipality and their local mass transit system to connect its intercity rails with other intracity options. Each was designed to look modern and provide services beyond just a stop. The crown jewel was the Miami Central Station, spanning some 9 acres or 4 city blocks and housing elevated platforms, restaurants and shops, some 300 parking spots, and 2 38-story towers holding 800 apartments. Just to turn this into a serviceable routing, to provide an hour and 15-minute trip from Miami to West Palm Beach for somewhere around $20 to $50 each way, it took Brightline 6 years of navigating everything from municipal and federal environmental impact statements to rail straightenings and multi-million-dollar construction projects. And that was just phase 1. Undaunted by delays or cost in the first place, Brightline began construction on a shining new station connected to the Orlando International Airport. And in the fall of 2023, service from Miami to Orlando opened to the public. And Brightline isn't slowing down, as work on phase 3 from Orlando to Tampa has already begun. But Brightline's biggest hurdle wasn't design, and it wasn't planning, and it wasn't construction, because Brightline was not just another passenger rail project. It was an American passenger rail project, and no matter how fiercely private it may insist it is, it wasn't going to get anywhere without a huge degree of political support, and that's tough to come by for passenger railways in America these days. But it tried a new technique. Publicly, it portrayed itself as a fully private, capitalistic organization developing a service at the whim of the free market at no risk to the taxpayer. Privately, though, it worked closely with the state and federal government to finally complete what politicians never could. Buried deep in the 500s of the 4,000 or so pages of the Internal Revenue Service's tax code is a series of sections setting strict parameters on a very particular financial mechanism known as private activity bonds, or PABs. And on page 555 in particular, one line of Part A of Section 142 opens up high-speed intercity rail as eligible issuers of PABs. PABs are simple in concept. Companies regularly issue bonds to raise money for big projects that they think will turn a profit in the long term, but that require a huge amount of upfront investment. They pay the buyer back in installments, plus interest, so the company will end up paying more than the bond purchase price in sum, but through this they can reduce what they need to pay annually to below their expected revenue. But as with any sort of earnings, the bond buyer has to pay taxes on the income generated by the bond's interest, unless they buy a government bond. Governments often issue tax-exempt bonds that still pay interest, yet include the right to not pay tax on that interest. This allows the government to offer a lower than average interest rate, which saves them money, yet still find bond buyers summing to the total they need since the lack of taxes offsets the reduced interest income. They're able to do this, of course, since they're also the authority in charge of setting tax policy. PABs, however, are an exceptional instance where non-government bonds qualify as tax-free, but only if the government says so. The government will approve the issuance of a certain value's worth of PABs if they believe a private company is doing something in the public interest that they want to incentivize, such as passenger rail development. Following an expansion of eligibility and issuances in 2005, the private sector jumped on the opportunity. Centerpoint, for example, raised some $225 million through PABs to build the country's largest inland port near Chicago, acting as a massive connecting node between America's truck and rail freight networks. Building, operating, and selling intermodal logistics hubs like this is the bread and butter of what Centerpoint does, but this was an opportunity to do so at a discount, and, in the federal government's eyes, foregoing the tens of millions of dollars of tax revenue was worth it to strengthen America's freight transportation network, even if it would be a profitable venture for a private enterprise, since improved freight logistics would likely raise the national tax base overall. But this is one of the most objectively private PAB-funded projects. Others blur the lines. The greater Louisville, Kentucky area has long had chronic traffic problems, especially given its geography sitting on the massive Ohio River. There used to be incredible backups to get to the Indiana side and vice versa. So the two states and the federal government decided they needed a bridge to its north to divert through traffic away from the city by connecting two isolated sections of interstate. Now, this undertaking was planned and designed by the government, yet when it came time to actually build and operate this massive, costly bridge, the entire project was essentially handed over to a consortium formed by Vinci and BBGI, two massive multinational infrastructure investment firms. This consortium then, on the federal government's blessing, went and issued $677 million in private activity bonds to pay for the construction of the bridge, and now, with it open, they're paying these bonds back using the toll revenue they collect from a long-term operating agreement lasting till 2051. From the public's perspective, though, this isn't anything novel. The bridge looks and operates just like any other toll bridge in America. But the private sector's encroachment into American infrastructure gets even more covert. 2 hours to the northwest, a section of state highway was set for an upgrade to meet federal interstate standards and form a part of the New Mexico to Canada I-69. But the state hired a private company not only to build the road, but to operate it. The company issued $244 million in PABs to finance the construction, yet in this case, there are no tolls. From the public's perspective, this is an entirely free section of interstate that operates just like any other, but in the background, Indiana is paying tens of millions per year in so-called availability payments for the company's work, allowing it to repay its bonds. Brightline is not many steps removed from that interstate or bridge or intermodal center. It's a private project, technically, but one that had little chance of ever happening without deep public sector support. Beyond myriad project approvals, Brightline financed its construction through $3 billion in tax-exempt private activity bonds. Now, this is not very different from a straight-up grant. The government has to approve PAB issuances, and foregone tax revenue costs them the same as an equivalent grant. So, in the long spectrum between fully private and fully public, you have a project like Louisville's new toll bridge sitting just over the line into the public side, and you have a project like Brightline just over the line into private. But both straddle the center of the public-private spectrum. Both are financing construction using tax-advantaged bonds, then recouping costs through user fees. There are some semantic distinctions that could be made based on who initiated the project or who owns the underlying infrastructure, but the critical difference, perhaps, is less so whether a project is or is not a public or private project, but rather what it's perceived as. All of recent history has demonstrated that there's no effective political will in America for passenger rail development. While it gets talked about constantly, nearly no meaningful progress has actually happened in the better part of a century. The common but almost entirely incorrect argument against its development is that there wouldn't be enough demand for widespread passenger rail in America due to lower population density and high car ownership rates, and therefore any service would operate at a loss, which would have to be paid for by the taxpayer. So, after decades of political gridlock against public rail projects in Florida, Brightline stepped in and argued that they could do the same, yet at no risk to the taxpayer. The public would get all the upside without any of the risk. This is almost true. Private activity bonds do minimize taxpayer risk, but they don't entirely eliminate it. The government only loses tax revenue if Brightline is successful because, in the alternate scenario, where the project is financed entirely by traditional private sector bonds, the government would not collect tax revenue if the company failed and investors didn't get repaid. They wouldn't have any taxable income. Therefore, on the surface level, this is effectively an ingenious type of grant that only incurs a cost when a project is successful, yet with essentially no downside risk. At least, that's what can be argued. In practice, it does get a bit more complicated than that. The institutional investors pouring money into Brightline bonds don't have an unlimited amount of money to invest, and therefore PABs inherently pull money away from traditional bonds and investments and lead to reduced tax revenue due to less investment money in taxable investments. In addition, in cases when PAB finance projects have gone wrong, it's not always the risk-free scenario that the politicians and project leaders promise it'll be. In the case of that section of I-69 in Indiana, the project failed. Mismanagement led to massive cost overruns that made it clear that the concessionaire would not be able to pay back its bondholders. This was a problem to the state of Indiana because the varying interest rates offered by different bond issuers are essentially a market-defined indicator of risk. If a bond is issued by a financially trustworthy source, like the United States government, it'll have quite a low interest rate, while if it's issued by a source where the market has less confidence in survival through the term of the bond, like an upstart tech company, the issuer will have to offer a higher interest rate in order to entice investors to buy the bond. So, in Indiana's case, if this private company did not pay back their loans, it would get more expensive for public-private partnerships statewide to get financing, since this was an indicator that perhaps the state was bad at selecting project partners, and therefore that there was a higher risk with all public-private partnerships in the state. Therefore, the state stepped in, took over the project, and paid the bondholders back in full even though they were not legally responsible for those bonds. The incentives just made it make financial sense in the long term. But despite the more muddled reality of private activity bonds and public-private infrastructure projects more broadly, what matters most when it comes to the successful development of American passenger rail is perception. It is no wonder that the promise of a project that at worst would create jobs and pour money into the state before sputtering out, at best would create a transportation system the envy of the entire nation, and do either at no risk to the taxpayer, worked. And even if that message isn't 100% true, it is mostly true, enough that the nuance gets ignored. Increasingly, it appears that the Brightline model of American rail development is replicable. Elsewhere in the Sun Belt, there's Texas Central Railway. Its pitch is similar, yet loftier. It plans to develop a true high-speed line between Dallas and Houston using Japanese Shinkansen technology, offering 90-minute trips between two massive, wealthy cities currently separated by 4 hours of highway. In their decade or so of existence, they've made meaningful progress towards this, having raised hundreds of millions in capital, acquired plenty of land on the route, and surpassed multiple political, legal, and permitting hurdles. While in their early years, Texas Central stayed consistent, insisting that funding would be 100% private, in more recent years, this messaging softened to open the door up to quiet public funding through mechanisms like PABs. In 2022, the company appeared to implode, with their CEO and key executives quietly announcing their departure with no notice or justification, and all assumed the ambitious venture was dead for good. Yet in 2023, it showed signs of life through a short and ambiguous press release by Amtrak. The government-owned rail operator announced it had partnered with Texas Central to continue early-stage development, and this partnership has actually started to move forward as the pair was awarded a modest $500,000 federal grant to continue their work. While still incredibly ambitious and far from likely to happen, this is at least a subtle indication that some in Washington identify the merits of a private sector face to American passenger rail projects, no matter how public they may be in practice. And further west, Brightline itself, or at least an affiliated company with common ownership and branding, is copy and pasting their business model onto a new geography, Los Angeles to Las Vegas. Like their Florida route, this is a massive Sunbelt travel corridor buoyed by tourism with relatively low construction costs, in this case due to the emptiness and flatness of the desert sitting between the two cities, rather than direct ownership of existing tracks. In this more progressive region, the company was able to find deeper public support, and in addition to billions of already approved PAB financing, the company was also awarded billions worth of state and federal grants, perhaps spurred on by the upcoming 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles and the company's bafflingly realistic promise to complete the project by then. So Brightline West has become the second private passenger rail project in America in the 21st century to tilt into likelier than not to happen. So much so that the Biden administration is already taking credit for their role in it. Yet, the reason why Brightline's audacious claims of building a passenger rail service in 4 years, or even building its Florida service in the first place, were believable is because they're focusing on the absolute lowest hanging fruit. They're developing service where there is just that perfect 3 or 4 hour travel time between two wealthy, touristy places, leading to high demand, mixed with perfect geography due to pre-existing rail alignments or a sparse landscape, leading to low construction costs. They're putting passenger trains where they have the absolute best chances of profitability, which is what any well-run private company would and should do. Perhaps the only problem with this is that that's what Amtrak should be doing. Effective passenger rail is not a business, but a public service. Roads are also a public service, meaning they're not built solely where they can turn a profit. If every road in America was converted to a fee-funded model, where users paid based on how much they use them, plenty of busy roads would be plenty profitable. Yet plenty more roads would fail to pay for themselves. America doesn't operate roads on a fee-funded model. Rather, taxpayer revenue is collected together to fund construction and maintenance overall, yet the same discrepancies exist. Some roads absolutely justify their cost directly, yet many more don't. The rural road connecting far-flung ranches to the city likely could never fund itself using a fee model, yet in the public service model, the public accepts this loss because it's considered that this connectivity is worth it for the ranches to be able to deliver product to processors, for example, and getting product to processors easily is worth it for everyone as it lowers the cost of food. Effectively, the taxpayer who only uses the busy urban highway is paying more than their fair share to subsidize that rural road, and the public generally accepts this because connectivity is good for all. Passenger rail systems should operate under a similar ethos because the exact same principles arise. Any effective system should, and globally does, use the profits from high traffic and less expensive corridors to offset the losses from low traffic and more expensive ones, since that nationwide connectivity does a lot more than just capture demand. It improves social and economic mobility, it grows the national economy, it does plenty that is worth it for the passengers that only ever take the high traffic line, justifying the profits from their trips to transfer to pay for the losses from another's. So, in a perfect world, Amtrak or another national rail operator would be reaping the profits from those Miami to Orlando or LA to Vegas trips and using them to run trains from Idaho Falls to Salt Lake City. But with each corridor that the private sector builds up, the potential of that perfect world diminishes. But of course, Amtrak and the government that has held it back have had decades to develop meaningful service on these routes and have not. So the time is long past to argue that we should delay good to get great. But hopefully this good scenario can tilt public sentiment in a way that prevents such potent pushback against national public sector rail development. Brightline, by all early measures, is a success. 190,000 passengers rode the company's new Miami to Orlando service in its first 70 days of operation, and the monthly averages continue to climb as they've upped frequency to 16 trains in each direction each day. Also, after just a few years of operation, the company's West Palm Beach to Miami segment attained operational profitability, with all indications suggesting that the long-distance segment to Orlando will follow in the coming years. This momentum seemingly pushed the affiliate company's Western expansion into reality with far more public support than it received for its initial service. Now, if this is the start of an American passenger rail renaissance, it's truly just the absolute tiniest of starts. The country has an unbelievably long way to go to catch up with the rest of the wealthy world, and many dominoes need to fall in the right direction for these private sector projects to lead to widespread public good. But at the very least, it's a believable start. It's a moment that one could imagine looking back on as the small start that cascaded into a passenger rail renaissance. This new era of private passenger rail development is an indication of how powerfully tweaking the underlying business model of something can lead to different results. Amtrak and Brightline are both running trains, but Brightline's business model has allowed it to do it better, faster, and in more places. We had similar thoughts when we started Nebula. A bunch of us creators came together and started talking about how we could design a business model for a streaming site that would lead to the best content possible. To start with, we got rid of ads. They incentivize creators to chase clicks over creating the best, most meaningful videos, and they also lead to highly variable revenue for the creator, which makes it tougher to plan financially. So instead we went with a subscription model. This allows us to set aside a portion of our monthly revenue for content development itself, which is what funds Nebula Originals, big budget, dream projects for creators that simply would not work financially on YouTube. Nebula recently released the Patrick Willems Holiday Special, including a guest appearance by me, the first couple episodes of Archaeology Quest by Real Science, and another Modern Conflicts video by Real Life Lore about the Lebanese Civil War. Nebula Originals are consistently great, and we spent much of 2023 working to develop the absolute best slate of releases for 2024 as possible, which are starting to come out at about the highest frequency we've ever had. In fact, we at Wendover are in production right now for our highest budget and most ambitious original to date, and for you Jetlag fans, as you likely know, you can also watch every single episode of the show 1 week early on Nebula. So, in all, Nebula offers you, the viewer, an ad-free experience watching a curated group of a few hundred of the best, most thoughtful creators out there, plus big budget originals by these same creators, and you get all of this for a surprisingly affordable price. When you sign up at our link, nebula.tv/Wendover, you'll get 40% off an annual subscription, which brings the cost down to the equivalent of just $2.50 a month. Wendover will even get a portion of that subscription fee for as long as you stay subscribed, so thanks in advance for signing up using our code.